The reins were too long for her hands. That was the first thing Cecily Marsh noticed when they were placed in her grip. The leather slack where a gentleman's broader palm would have caught it taut. She shortened her hold without thinking, without hesitating, the way a woman shortens a sleeve hem or adjusts a borrowed shawl, the small practical correction of someone accustomed to working with what she had been given rather than what fit. The gray stallion beneath her shifted his weight, testing her, and she felt the tremor travel up through the stirrups and into the bones of her legs. She did not move. She sat still, back straight, chin level, and let the horse feel that she was not afraid. Behind her, arranged along the paddock fence like a painting of the county's sporting set in their natural habitat, stood perhaps 20 people who had come to Ashvale Park for the autumn shooting party. Gentlemen in boots, ladies with their hands folded at their waists. Mr. Alistair Fenn, whom she had heard laugh 3 times in the last quarter of an hour. And in the center of them, not touching the fence, not raising his voice, the Duke of Ashvale himself, Nicholas Calder, watching her with his arms crossed and his jaw set, and his gray eyes offering nothing at all. She had been here 6 minutes. She had been a lady's maid at Ashvale Park for 11 months. She had not, in those 11 months, spoken more than 20 words directly to the Duke. She had folded his mother's handkerchiefs. She had pressed Miss Vane's evening gowns when that lady visited. She had carried trays and opened curtains and kept her eyes directed at the floor whenever she passed through a room where her employers were present. None of that had changed what she was about to do. Phantom moved again, a sideways step that the watching grooms reached toward involuntarily, and Cecily shifted her seat, her weight moving with him, fluid and precise. He settled. She gathered the reins and touched her heel to his flank, and the great horse moved forward into a walk, then a trot, then a canter that swept the full length of the paddock in a silence that Cecily would remember, afterward, as one of the most complete silences she had ever produced. She had the worn leather riding gloves tucked in her apron pocket. They had been her father's, too large, smelling still faintly of his study and the stables he had built before the money was gone. She had not reached for them before mounting. She had not had time. The county watched. Cecily rode. She had come to Ashvale Park the previous November, when the leaves along the southern drive had been mostly down and the first frost had salted the kitchen garden overnight. She had come with a single trunk, a letter of reference from the rector of the village where her father had practiced, and a wardrobe that her mother would have called serviceable, and her old life would have called near poverty. Her father, Mr. Gerald Marsh, had been a respected country solicitor for 22 years. Then a client's investment had failed, and her father had guaranteed the debt out of misplaced loyalty, and the house in Herefordshire had been sold, and her engagement to Mr. Thomas Alcott, a young man of equal standing and ordinary ambitions, had dissolved inside a fortnight of the announcement. She had not been surprised. That was the part she returned to sometimes in the dark of her small room at the top of the east wing, the part that still troubled her more than the loss itself. She had not been surprised. She had looked at Thomas's face across the drawing room of his father's house, and understood, before he spoke, that she had always been chosen contingently, that the choosing had depended on a condition she was no longer able to meet, and that she had known this at some level all along. She had been chosen when she was convenient. She had not yet been chosen when she was not. She had taken the position at Ashvale because it was available, and because the alternative, moving to a cousin's house in Bath to serve as a useful relation, had seemed to her a quieter kind of erasure than outright service. At Ashvale, she was at least honestly employed. She rose at 5. She prepared Lady Dorothea's morning correspondence. She pressed and aired and mended. She was addressed as Marsh by the senior staff and not addressed at all by the family, which was correct and expected, and which she had accommodated into the arrangement of her days without great difficulty. She had not told anyone about the dawn rides. It had begun 2 months after her arrival, in January, when a hard freeze had locked the eastern meadow, and Phantom had been kept stabled past his patience. She had been crossing the stable yard at first light with a basket of mending when she heard him. Not a frightened sound, not aggression, but the specific high-pitched complaint of an animal who has been still too long. The head groom, Mr. Stowe, had not yet arrived. The stable lad was asleep in the tack room. She had gone in. She did not know, at that moment, that the gray stallion was the most dangerous animal at Ashvale. She did not know that 3 experienced grooms had been unseated in the autumn, and that the Duke himself had not ridden the horse since inheriting him. She knew only that the horse was distressed, and that she could read horses, had learned to read them from her father's small stable in Herefordshire, and that this one wanted to move. She had tacked him herself, quietly and quickly, and taken him out onto the frozen meadow before anyone was awake to see her. And when she brought him back half an hour later, his sides were heaving, and his eye was calm, and she was breathing hard from the cold air, and something that was not quite happiness, but was closer to it than anything she had felt in a year. Mr. Stowe had been waiting at the stable door. He had looked at her for a long moment without speaking. Then he had said, "You rode him?" And she had said, "Yes." And he had looked at the horse, and he had said, "He is quieter." And she had said, "He needs more work than he is getting." And Mr. Stowe had nodded once and held the stable door, and said nothing further, ever, to anyone. She had ridden Phantom perhaps 30 times before the morning the Duke saw her. She did not know which morning he had first appeared at the east wall of the kitchen garden, where a stone gate gave a clear sight line to the lower meadow. She had not been watching for witnesses. She had been riding, which was the only hour in her week when she was not managing the needs of another person, not directing her attention outward and downward, not performing the careful contraction of self that her position required. She had been going fast, going free, and the gray horse had been with her, entirely with her, the 2 of them in the gray light of 6 in the morning, as though the estate and the county and the hierarchy that organized both had not yet woken up to arrange them correctly. She learned later, from the expression on his face during the paddock challenge, that he had seen her 3 times. The morning gathering had been Lady Dorothea's arrangement. She had invited the neighboring sporting families to Ashvale for 3 days, and the Duke had accommodated this with the contained courtesy that characterized all his dealings with his mother. Cecily had spent the 2 days prior pressed into extra service for the visit, arranging rooms, pressing gowns, assisting with the organization of what Lady Dorothea called the sporting day. The morning of the gathering, she had been sent to the stables at 7 with a message from Mr. Stowe regarding the carriage horses, and she had been standing in the stable yard, waiting for him to finish with a shoe. When the party arrived, Lady Dorothea had come first, magnificent in dove gray, and a Spencer jacket trimmed with military buttons, Miss Honoria Vane at her side. Miss Vane was 24, and composed and utterly correct. The kind of woman Cecily's mother would have called accomplished without qualification, and Cecily had learned to recognize as a particular kind of armor. She wore ice blue even in the October chill, and she had never, in Cecily's observation, looked at a horse as though it interested her. "She is only the maid, Honoria," Lady Dorothea said, low but carrying, as the party moved past the stable gate. Not to Cecily, to Miss Vane. As though Cecily were an arrangement of the furniture rather than a person capable of hearing. She has been sent on an errand. She will be out of the way shortly. Cecily had not looked up. She had kept her attention on the stable door. The gathering settled itself at the paddock fence within the quarter hour, the conversation turning to horses, as it naturally did among this county's sporting set, and Phantom was brought out for discussion, because Phantom was always discussed. He was the puzzle of Ashvale, the unsolved horse, the gray that had killed his previous rider and was kept at great expense for reasons no one quite understood. Mr. Fenn had opinions. He always had opinions. He was the kind of man who gathered facts about other men's property and presented them at social gatherings as wit. 4 grooms down since Ashvale brought him home, Fenn said, loudly enough for the paddock to carry. Nobody's put a proper ride on him in 2 years. Be cheaper to sell the beast. The Duke had said nothing. He had been standing at the far end of the gathering, not quite part of it, his attention directed toward the horse in a way that was different from the others' attention, heavier, more private. Then his gaze had moved to Cecily. She had felt it before she met it, the way one feels a change in the air's temperature before identifying its direction. She had looked up and found him looking at her, and the expression on his face was not what she had expected. It was not amusement. It was not the casual authority of an employer surveying his household. It was something she did not have a name for, something that reminded her, uncomfortably, of a man deciding. "Miss Marsh," he said. The gathering fell into a surprised quiet. A duke did not address the maid at a social gathering. He simply did not. "Your Grace," she said. He uncrossed his arms. He looked at Phantom, and then back at her. And then he said, in a voice that was perfectly level and entirely without warmth, that she could detect, "I am told Phantom wants a rider. The grooms are occupied. Will you ride him?" She heard, from somewhere to her left, a small, strangled sound from one of the footmen. She heard Mr. Fenn begin a sentence and stop it. She heard, close behind her, Miss Vane's fan click open once. She looked at the horse. Phantom was watching her, his ear turned toward her, just slightly, the way a dog tracks a known voice. She reached into her apron pocket and found the worn leather gloves. She did not put them on. She tucked them back and turned to the stable block and found a mounting block with the efficiency of a woman who had done it in the dark, and she was up before Mr. Fenn had finished the sentence he had restarted. "She is just the maid," Fenn said, laughing now, addressing the gathering. "Does Ashvale mean to pass the horse to the domestics?" The gathering laughed, some of them, in the uncertain way of people unsure whether to follow the joke or the Duke's lead. The Duke had not laughed. He was watching Phantom and Cecily, and the way she had settled herself into the saddle, and his face had closed down completely in a way that Cecily could not yet read. She rode. She rode as she had ridden in the January dark, and in the February thaw, and in the sharp March mornings when the frost broke and the meadow steamed, and Phantom collected beneath her the way he always did when she asked him correctly, which was not loudly and not harshly, but with the specific quality of attention he seemed to need. The clear and continuous conversation between her weight and his back and her hands and his mouth, that said, plainly, "I know you. You know me. We will do this together." She cantered the perimeter. She took the gate at the south end at a full gallop and brought him down smooth and turned on a turn so tight the watching grooms made a collective sound against their will. She brought him back to the fence and halted him directly in front of the Duke and sat quietly while Phantom blew once, twice, and stood. The gathering was completely silent. Nicholas Calder looked at her for a long moment. His jaw was set. Something moved in his gray eyes that was not coldness, or if it was coldness, it was the kind that precedes breaking. Then he said, "Thank you, Miss Marsh," and the party around him dissolved into murmur and movement, and Cecily dismounted and returned the horse to the groom, who had materialized at her elbow, and she walked back to the house because she had a basket of mending to deliver, and there was nothing else for her to do. If she had been anyone else, it might have been the beginning of something immediate. It was not. The Duke of Ashvale was not a man who acted immediately on anything, and Cecily Marsh was not a woman who expected action on her behalf. And between those two fixed facts, the story that followed arranged itself with more difficulty and more cost than a simple public recognition. The morning after the ride, he stopped her in the long corridor that connected the kitchen wing to the main house, the corridor she walked twice daily, and he had no ordinary reason to traverse. He had come from the library. She knew, because the corridor smelled of the leather binding oil that was used on the shelves there, and his coat carried it faintly when he passed. He stopped. She stopped. A lady's maid in a corridor, alone with a duke, was not a comfortable arrangement, and she felt the impropriety of it settle on her shoulders alongside the basket she was carrying. She should have kept walking. She could have, with perfect justification, simply continued past him. She did not. He did not speak for a moment. He looked at her, and the quality of it was the same as it had been at the paddock, the same undisclosed and considerable attention, and she felt her pulse in the hollow of her throat and forced her face to stay neutral. "You have ridden before," he said. "Yes, Your Grace." "Where did you learn?" "My father kept horses." He looked at her, and she had the very specific sensation of being read accurately by someone who was not supposed to be reading her at all. "Your father," he said, as though he already knew the answer. And perhaps he did. Perhaps he had inquired. The possibility unsettled her in a way she did not examine. "Yes, Your Grace," she said again. He nodded once. He moved to let her pass. As she passed him, she felt the warmth of him at close distance, the particular fact of his nearness, and her hand found the basket handle and tightened on it for no reason except that her hands needed something to hold. She did not look back. The library was the room where she found him next, though she had not been sent there, and had not sought him out. She had been searching for a misplaced monograph that Lady Dorothea required, a book on the management of country houses that had been borrowed by one of the visiting gentlemen and not returned, and she had traced it through 3 rooms and arrived at the library door to find it open, and the Duke inside. He was at the far window, not reading, his back to the room and his attention given entirely to something she could not see outside, something in the direction of the stables. He did not hear her enter, or if he did not turn. She found the monograph on the second shelf from the left and withdrew it without speaking. She had almost reached the door. "Miss Marsh," he said. She stopped. She turned. He had not moved from the window. He was looking at her now, though, across the full length of the room, and the afternoon light from the glass behind him made a kind of frame of him, tall and still and slightly underlit, and she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that he was a man who had been very unhappy for a long time. "Those gloves," he said. "You carry them each morning." She was holding the monograph. The gloves were in her pocket. "They were my father's," she said. "They are not suitable for wear, but I keep them." He moved then, crossing the room, and stopped perhaps 4 feet from her. He looked at her hands on the monograph, then at the visible edge of worn leather at her pocket, and he reached out. She felt the intention of the reach before it arrived, the way one feels a held breath. His hand lifted toward the gloves, toward the pocket's edge, and stopped there, suspended, at the last moment, as though some calculation had interrupted the gesture. He let his hand fall. "Edmund's horse," he said, not looking at her now, looking at the window. "Phantom. You know what happened?" "Mr. Stowe told me, eventually." "Yes." "Edmund picked him himself." He paused. "The year before the accident, I told him the horse was sound. I had seen the horse 3 times. I said it was sound. The muscles in his jaw worked once, briefly. I was wrong." She did not speak. She understood now the quality of his attention to the horse, the weight in it, the specific color of a man who has been carrying a verdict about himself for 2 years. She understood also now why he had never ridden Phantom. Not stubbornness. Not sentiment. Penance. "The horse is sound," she said. "He is simply misunderstood." He looked at her. Something shifted in his expression that she did not know how to name. Not surprise exactly, not gratitude. Something more private than either. "Yes," he said. "So I had begun to believe." She left the library. She went to deliver the monograph and did not, for the remainder of the day, allow herself to think about what he had said, or the reaching hand, or the particular quality of stillness in a man deciding not to cross a line he had come close to crossing. Lady Dorothea had arranged the autumn house party with the precision she applied to all social operations, which meant that it had a purpose no one was meant to acknowledge aloud. The purpose was Miss Honoria Vane. Miss Vane had been at Ashvale 3 times in the past year, each visit extending by 2 or 3 days, each visit during which the Duke had behaved with perfect courtesy and no warmth that Cecily had ever observed. The Dowager Duchess did not find this discouraging. She found it characteristic of her son and correctable by continued arrangement. "He will come around," Cecily had heard her say once, through a half-open sitting-room door. "Men of his character always do when the match is unimpeachable. Honoria is unimpeachable." She had not known then that the remark was the opening pressure on a spring she would eventually feel close around her. The evening of the 4th day of the house party, Mrs. Agnes Holt found Cecily in the upper corridor with an expression that Cecily had learned to read as news being carried reluctantly. Mrs. Holt was the housekeeper, 60 years old, and had the quality of a person who had survived Ashvale through 4 changes of household and 3 different versions of Lady Dorothea's social ambitions. She was not unkind. "I have been asked to tell you," she said quietly, "that you will be released from your position at the end of the month." Cecily heard it. She stood still and heard it, and felt it move through her the way cold water moves, complete and certain. "By whom?" "Her Grace." A pause. She said, and I am sorry to repeat it exactly, that she could not have just the maid underfoot during what she called a delicate period of family arrangement. "She said you had overstepped, that the paddock exhibition was an embarrassment." Cecily said. "I was asked." "I know. I was asked by the Duke." "I know that too," Mrs. Holt said, and her voice was tired and precise. "And she knows it as well. The order came from her, and in this household, her orders stood." A pause. "I am sorry, Miss Marsh. I have tried to say nothing, but I will say this. You have conducted yourself here with more dignity than circumstances have required of you, and this is not justice." Cecily thanked her. She went to her room. She sat on the narrow bed and looked at her hands for a long time, and then she reached into the pocket of her dress and held the riding gloves, and did not cry, because there was no use in crying, and because she had understood from the time the money was gone that she would be required to remake herself each time the world changed its mind about whether she fit. What she did not do was leave quietly. The following morning she went to the east drawing-room, where Lady Dorothea took her morning coffee, because she had something to return. 3 days prior, she had found, wedged between the cushion of the settee and the guest suite where Miss Vane was staying, a small diamond brooch that had belonged to the late Duchess, a piece Cecily had pressed and returned a half-dozen times and recognized at once. She had set it on the mantel of her own room with the intention of returning it properly to Mrs. Holt. She had not yet done so. She did so now, directly, carrying it on a small card and presenting it to the Dowager herself. Lady Dorothea looked at the brooch. She looked at Cecily. The expression that passed over her face was not quite what Cecily had expected. It was more complicated, a flicker of something that was almost acknowledgement before it was covered again by the customary certainty. "Where did you find it?" "In the guest suite, Your Grace. 3 days ago." "You kept it 3 days." "I intended to return it through Mrs. Holt. I should have done so immediately. I apologize for the delay." A long pause. Lady Dorothea's fan, folded, tapped once against her palm. "You may go," she said. Cecily went. She did not know who had seen the exchange. She did not know, at the time, that the Duke had been on the gallery above the east drawing-room, waiting to speak to his mother, and that he had heard the whole of it from above, the clear voices traveling up through the morning quiet of the house. She did not know that he had stood there without moving until she had left the room, and that afterward he had stood there a while longer, his hands at his sides and his face arranged in the expression of a man confirming something he had already decided. He found her in the garden that afternoon. The kitchen garden. Not the ornamental one. She was trimming back the last of the climbing roses at the east wall, a task no one had asked her to do but that clearly needed doing, the cane sprawling across the gate in a way that would damage them over winter. She was wearing her plainest dress, and her hair was simply dressed, and she had scratched her right wrist on a thorn and was pressing the scratch against her palm when she heard his step on the gravel path. She turned. He stopped several feet from her, at the edge of the grass, and looked at her in that way he had, that she had begun to understand, was not coldness, but its opposite, some enormous and rigorously controlled attention that he had never, apparently, found a socially acceptable channel for. "You're leaving," he said. "At the end of the month." "Yes." "My mother told you." Mrs. Holt conveyed the message. He was quiet. She had the thorns in her left hand and the scratch on her right, and the October wind pressing the smell of dying roses over both of them, and the quality of the silence between them was different from the silence in the corridor or the library. It had an urgency to it, a pressure, as though he were deciding something in real time, and she was required to wait. "I do not want you to go," he said. His voice was quiet. Not soft. Not a soft-voiced man, but deliberate. Each word placed with the care of someone who had not said this kind of thing in some time. She looked at him. Her pulse was in her wrist where the thorn had caught her. She felt him at this distance the way she felt Phantom when the horse was standing still and thinking, the potential energy of a large and careful creature that was being very careful about which direction to move. "Your Grace," she said, and meant it as a gentle correction, a reminder of what the words could and could not mean. "Nicholas," he said. She looked away. She could not look at him directly when he said that. "You should not," she said. "No," he agreed. "I should not." Neither of them moved. The wind shifted. A late rose hip, deeply red, fell from the climbing canes and landed between them on the path. "The brooch," he said. "You found it 3 days ago." "Yes." "And did not sell it." "It was not mine." "It was worth £20. That is irrelevant." She met his eyes. "It was not mine." He looked at her for a long time with that expression she had stopped trying to name, the one that was not coldness and not warmth exactly, but something that seemed to be the place where the two met. "Come to dinner tonight," he said. I am a maid, Your Grace. I serve dinner. I do not attend it. Tomorrow night, he said, there is a gathering of the county families, a formal dinner. You will attend as a guest. He paused. I am asking you, not commanding. She looked at him. Your mother will not permit it. My mother, he said very quietly, does not give the orders at Ashvali. She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, she has said otherwise in my hearing on more than one occasion. She has been operating under a misapprehension. He looked at the rose hip on the path between them. That misapprehension will be corrected tomorrow night. He looked back at her. Will you come? If she had been anyone else, she might have asked what he meant. She had read horses all her life, and she understood that what he was asking her was not whether she would attend a dinner. She understood the shape of what he was carrying to the table. She understood that it would cost him something. The straightforward authority of a man who had lived for 2 years behind glass. Unreachable. Not because he was cold, but because he did not trust himself. Because he had declared a horse sound once, and been wrong, and paid for it in a way no one could see. She understood that she was being asked whether she would stand in the arena and let him stand beside her. She thought of Thomas Alcott's face across the drawing room, the apology in it, the withdrawal. She thought of her father's stables in the morning light. She thought of 30 dawns on Phantom's back, going fast, going free, before the world was awake to arrange her correctly. Yes, she said, I will come. The formal dinner at Ashvale was the largest gathering of the county's principal families since the shooting party 2 autumns prior, the one that had taken place while the estate was still in the late Duke's hands, and the county had not yet adjusted to Nicholas's different style of occupation. 26 covers were laid in the long dining room. The candles were lit at 6. Lady Dorothea was dressed in midnight blue with the diamonds that had not gone to Miss Vane, and Miss Vane was beside her in a column of pale ivory that suited her in the way that all things suited her, correctly and without feeling. Cecily wore her best dress, which was a deep green wool that she had bought in the autumn before her father's trouble with money she had thought she would have, cut in the current fashion, but simply made, without the ornament that would have updated it. She had dressed her hair carefully. She had left the riding gloves on her small dresser table, not in her pocket, which was the first time in 11 months she had left the house without them. She arrived in the entrance hall at 6:30. Lady Dorothea saw her at once. The expression that passed over the dowager's face was a sequence of calculations conducted in roughly 2 seconds, their outcome not yet visible, not yet anything one could read except as a pause that held more than pauses usually held. Miss Vane's gaze moved from Cecily to the dowager, and back again with the careful attention of a woman accustomed to reading rooms. You are not expected here, Lady Dorothea said. Not loudly. She did not need volume. Mrs. Holt has made your situation clear. You are to leave at the end of the month. She has been invited, said Nicholas's voice. He had come from the library, and he was in full evening dress, and Cecily had not allowed herself to imagine how he would look in evening dress, because she was a practical woman. But she found now that she had not managed to correctly anticipate the effect of it. The navy coat precisely fitted, the white cravat precisely tied, the whole of him arranged with that particular quality of stillness he brought to every room. He came to stand beside Cecily, close enough that the county could see the intention of the placement. Lady Dorothea looked at him. Her fan opened once, fully, in what Cecily had learned was her physical expression of gathering herself for a campaign. Nicholas, she said, this is not the occasion for a whim. It is not a whim, he said. She is a maid. She has no business at this table." His voice dropped just slightly, as though the lowering would make the words more private, though the entrance hall carried everything. "She is just the maid, Nicholas, and you will embarrass the family and Miss Vane and yourself." The entrance hall was quiet. Everyone present was looking at either the Duke or Cecily or both, in the way that audiences look when a scene has begun that they were not expecting. Nicholas looked at his mother for a moment. Then he looked at Cecily. She met his eyes. Her hands were still. Her breathing was slow and even, the way it was on Phantom when the horse was testing whether she would panic. She did not panic. He held her gaze for one breath, two. Then he turned back to the room. "Miss Marsh is to be my Duchess," he said. "That is all." The silence that followed was the second most complete silence Cecily had ever produced. Lady Dorothea's fan stilled in her hand. Miss Honoria Vane looked at the middle distance with an expression of quiet recalibration, the face of a woman who had understood, privately, that the announcement was probable, and who had prepared herself for the probability with more grace than her sponsor. The county families arranged around the entrance hall made a collection of small involuntary movements, the half-step, the inhale, the exchanged glance, that constituted 20 people rearranging their understanding of the social order of the room. Mr. Fenn, who had been standing near the window, said nothing at all. Nicholas took Cecily's hand and placed it on his arm, the formal gesture, the claiming one. The gesture that the county would describe to their households tomorrow morning as the moment when the Duke of Ashvale looked up. Cecily's hand was steady. She was not trembling. She was not, she discovered, even afraid. She was looking at the entrance to the dining room and feeling the warmth of his arm beneath her hand and thinking, with something very close to clarity, that she had ridden a horse no one else could manage and had not fallen off, and that this was not entirely unlike. Lady Dorothea said, at last, quietly, to no one in particular, "I did not expect this." "No," said Nicholas. "I know." He offered her his arm. Then, in the formal gesture of a son escorting his mother, and after a pause that lasted perhaps 3 seconds, she took it. And the party moved into the dining room. And the candles were already lit. And the first course was already arranged. And nobody said anything that mattered for the rest of the evening, and everything was utterly different. The county went home. Miss Vane went home. With a composed farewell that contained nothing one could call bitterness, and nothing one could call warmth. The farewell of a woman who had always been too accomplished to be destroyed by a single campaign's failure. Lady Dorothea remained at Ashvale, as she had always remained, and spent a week in a silence that Cecily recognized as a woman revising her position, and then one morning called for Cecily in the south sitting room and said, "You will need to be properly dressed," in a tone that was not warm but was not cold either, more like stone that has absorbed enough sunlight to be almost pleasant. The announcement was made formally in December, before the county had dispersed entirely for the winter. In the drawing room of Ashvele, with the fire high and snow beginning outside the long windows, Cecily wore the green wool dress again, because she had not yet been outfitted in anything else, and because she had a feeling, specific and unexamined, that it mattered to wear the thing she had worn when she arrived. Nicholas stood beside her and addressed the small assembled group with the economy of a man who had already said the most important thing he intended to say and did not see the need to repeat himself. Afterward, when the guests had taken their mulled wine into the next room, and the drawing room was briefly empty of everyone except the two of them, he reached into his coat pocket and produced her riding gloves. She looked at them. They were worn at the palm and too large, and unmistakably her father's. "I borrowed them from your dresser table," he said. "Mr. Stowe showed me your room when I asked where to find them. You left them this morning." "I was not riding this morning," she said. "No." He held them out. "I thought you might want them anyway." She took them. She held them. The familiar weight and the familiar smell. The stitching her father's hands had worn soft. The leather that had held his grip in 100 mornings she had not been there for. Nicholas was watching her, not with the guarded quality she had first known, but with the openness of a man who has stopped performing a careful management of himself and is simply present. His grief was still there, not the kind that resolves entirely, not the kind with a named date and a declared ending. It was no longer the whole of him. She could see past it to something else. "Edmund would have liked you," he said. She did not speak for a moment. "You told me he chose the horse. He chose everything too quickly and with great confidence." A pause that held something that was not quite a smile, but lived in the same country. "I choose slowly, and usually badly. Until now." Outside the long windows, the snow was coming down in earnest, settling on the stone balustrade and the stripped rose beds and the paddock fence where the county had stood watching. That October morning, when the gray horse had collected himself beneath a maid's steady hands, and the county had gone very quiet, and a duke had watched from the fence with an expression that nobody had been able to read, but which Cecily, now, could. She had been seen. Not when she entered the drawing room or delivered the monograph or wore the green wool dress. Long before any of that. At 6 in the morning on a frozen meadow, going fast, going free, before anyone was awake to arrange her correctly. He had seen her then, and the seeing had not been contingent on anything except what she actually was. And he had held it like a fact, and waited until he could name it properly. She put her hand in the worn gloves, the 2 large ones, her father's, and they fit now the same way they always had, imperfectly, carrying the shape of someone else's hands alongside her own, and she found she did not mind that. One could hold 2 shapes at once, could carry what was gone alongside what was here, and still have hands left over for the work. She looked at Nicholas. He was looking at her. The fire was very warm behind them both, and the snow outside was white against the gray stone walls of Ashvale. And the house was quiet around them in the specific way of a place that has found its arrangement after a long uncertainty. If you have found yourself returning to stories like this one, the quiet dignity finally seen, the long patience finally met, leave a word in the comments below. Your company in these stories means more than you know. She closed her hands around the worn leather, and the room held them, and the snow kept falling, and it was enough.